Good afternoon. Welcome to the launch event for USAID's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. I'm Marty Flax. I'm the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism and Director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS. And on behalf of the Human Rights Initiative and the Project on Prosperity and Development, we're really delighted to have you here for this important event, both those of you in the room, and we've got a great crowd today here in the room, and all of you watching online. The establishment of this Bureau comes at a troubling time for democracy, human rights, and governance around the world. I don't have to tell anyone in the room that. We've all heard the statistics. 17 years of democratic decline, according to Freedom House. Survey results like the ones from Pew that say even in democracies, only a slim majority of people are actually satisfied with how their government is delivering and what democracy is providing to them. The Corruption Perceptions Index, whose average score, country score, has not improved in 10 years, and where 2/3 of countries continue to score below 50 out of 100. And we only have to turn on the news, of course, to see the struggles that millions of people around the world continue to face in securing their human rights. Both President Biden and his administration and their national security strategy have placed human rights and democracy at the center of U.S. foreign policy. Rhetorically, President Biden has talked about stemming the tide of authoritarianism as the defining challenge of our time. But we know and we can see from what's happening around the world that the strategies we're employing are not successful. They're not fully successful. And that we need to be doing more. We need to be thinking more creatively, and we need to be working more closely across different communities to tackle these challenges. And so it's appropriate then that the US government is adapting its own organization to stand up to this evolving challenge of our time. USAID is no stranger to these issues, of course. Since the 1990s, USAID's been partnering with governments and communities all around the world to build more democratic and resilient societies. Alongside its work on economic development and other issues, USAID has been promoting human rights and democracy through its work on free and fair and inclusive elections, independent media, labor organizations, and advocacy organizations for marginalized groups. And so the creation of the GRG Center not that long ago was an important step in the consolidation of these efforts. And today's launch, or this year's launch of the DRG Bureau, will further integrate this work with all the important work being done across USAID, from economic growth to climate change, and of course across the entire US government. So I'm really excited for today's program. We're going to have a chance to hear from the leadership of the new Bureau about its approaches and its priorities. And after that, we're going to have a fantastic panel discussion facilitated by my colleague Noam Unger, to delve further into the role that this new Bureau can play in the democracy, human rights, and governance space. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Shannon Green, the Assistant to the Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. Shannon previously served as Executive Director of USAID's Anti-Corruption Task Force and as the Senior Director for Global Engagement at the National Security Council. Most importantly, she is the former director of the program I now run here at CSIS, the Human Rights Initiative, and we're just thrilled to have her back in the building. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marty, for that kind introduction. It's great to be back at CSIS, and it's really my pleasure to be with all of you at the beginning of a new chapter, not just for USAID, but for all of us in the democracy, human rights, and governance community. Today, it is not a surprise to say that there is a great global contest between democracy and autocracy. Nowhere is this more evident than in Guatemala, where Bernardo Arevalo, an anti-corruption campaigner, pulled off a surprising showing in the country's first round of elections and ultimately emerged as the people's choice for the country's next president. This is a win for democracy and human rights and a blow to corruption. Yet entrenched interests that favor the status quo are not going to give up easily. Despite Arevalo's overwhelming electoral victory, his party has faced an uphill battle in the lead up to Inauguration Day in January. This includes a sustained campaign to undermine Guatemala's electoral process. Ballot boxes were literally seized from the election authorities' warehouse in efforts to invalidate his political party. Unfortunately, as Marty alluded to, this is not an isolated case. These kinds of struggles are increasing all around the world. The challenges abound and are very familiar to those in this room. The resurgence of authoritarianism, the rise in attacks by anti-rights actors, misuse of technology and rampant disinformation, the rise of strategic and transnational corruption, growing inequality and injustice, and malign actions by Russia and the PRC to undermine faith in democracy itself and to chip away at the international human rights regime. And let's make no mistake about it, much of this is due to dynamics and weaknesses internal to democracy, including their inability to deliver. However, at USAID, we choose to see the glass as half full. And that is because every day we get to bear witness to the courageous efforts of human rights defenders, civic activists, anti-corruption champions, and democratic reformers who are fighting for freedom, for more inclusive and equitable governance and human rights, oftentimes at great personal cost. Since October 7th, dozens of journalists have been killed and injured in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon as they sought to document the horrific situation unfolding there and ensure accurate reporting amidst a wave of disinformation. Just this week, Narges Mohammadi was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her activism in leading the women, life, and freedom movement in Iran. She, like so many other activists, have tirelessly fought for their rights to be respected and are sitting in jail or in exile because of it. And yet they persist. So must we. We are also hopeful at USAID because despite these immense setbacks, freedom still beats in the hearts of people the world over. This isn't just my opinion. We actually have data to support it. According to the 2023 Open Society Barometer, which surveyed 30 countries, 86% of the respondents say that they want to live in a democracy. Authoritarian arguments to the contrary, we know that democracies are uniquely capable of generating the conditions that allow every member of society to thrive. They are better at delivering economic opportunity and providing public goods. They spend more on social protection, and they have more ambitious climate policies than dictatorships. Despite these advantages, there is no hiding from the fact that democracy is facing historic headwinds. To turn the situation around, we need new tools, new structures, new partnerships, and new programs, building on USAID's longstanding investments and successes in the DRG sector. And that is what we aim to do with the creation of the DRG Bureau. With the establishment of the DRG Bureau, USAID will have the leadership, influence, and capacity we need to help shift the global trajectory towards greater freedom, responsive and accountable governance, and respect for human rights. USAID is unique in possessing under one roof the range of tools, expertise, and capacities needed to confront the massive interlocking problems facing the world today. But given the immense scale of the challenge, we cannot do so alone. And that is why the Bureau is focused on harnessing all of USAID's investments to pursue democratic progress. In her article, How Democracy Can Win, Administrator Power wrote that one of our biggest errors has been to ignore the linkages between democracy and development. She argued that we have focused too narrowly on political rights and freedoms without appreciating that the lack of economic opportunity, widespread inequality, and the injustice of corruption were compromising people's faith in democratic governance. We are seeking to remedy that. The Bureau is spearheading a whole-of-agency approach to democratic renewal, leveraging all of the resources and capabilities and partnerships at our disposal to drive meaningful change. We believe that this approach will amplify both sectoral outcomes and accelerate democratic development. In addition to leveraging the work outside of the DRG sector, we are turning our focus towards new and crucial fronts in the struggle between autocracy and democracy. Launched at the first Summit for Democracy in 2021, the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal is a landmark set of foreign assistance and policy initiatives to counter authoritarianism, bolster honest and open government, and defend human rights. It includes supporting independent media and investigative journalists to withstand contemporary threats and pressures. For example, we are covering the cost of legal defense for reporters who are facing lawsuits that are meant to intimidate them or put them out of business. And we are creating new data tools to help local independent media adapt their business models so that they can survive and even thrive at a time when so many local media outlets are shuttering. We are mobilizing financial and other forms of support for organizers and citizen-led social movements that are advancing human rights, social justice, and inclusive development throughout the world. We are dismantling the barriers and addressing the online and offline threats that keep women and girls from exercising political leadership. And finally, as part of our commitment to countering transnational corruption, grand corruption, and kleptocracy, we are working with global, regional, and national actors to close financial loopholes, detect dirty money, and follow its path across borders. Of course, we recognize that democratic progress cannot be achieved through programming alone. We are seizing the creation of the DRG Bureau to shape global policy and encourage positive change in the countries in which we work. In 2024 alone, there are 65 elections across 54 countries, many of which will be critical for either moving those countries forward on a democratic path or pushing them towards a growing list of countries that are backsliding. USAID is using its voice and its convening power to promote credible political processes, including the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity, a platform to advocate for, reinforce, and where needed, promote updates to election integrity norms and principles, make elections more inclusive, anticipate and preempt threats, and take action to defend electoral integrity globally. To address digital repression and set the course for the rights-respecting use of technology, just last week, we launched the Donor Principles for Human Rights in the Digital Age at the Internet Governance Forum in Kyoto, Japan. This new set of principles provide donor governments with a blueprint to ensure that our digital investments align with human rights and democratic values. Of course, none of this is possible if we go it alone. In order to achieve our ambitious democracy goals, USAID must foster meaningful partnerships and coalitions with multilateral bodies, bilateral and philanthropic donors, the private sector, global influencers, and implementing partners. We need to work together to support the brave individuals on the front lines who are really the ones who are making change happen. And that means making concrete investments in their work. At the second Summit for Democracy, USAID launched the Integrity for Development campaign, an effort to exponentially increase the resource envelope for anti-corruption efforts globally. This campaign calls on foundations, bilateral donors, and multilateral actors to match USAID's planned $250 million investment in anti-corruption, with the goal of bringing $500 million to the promotion of accountability, transparency, and public integrity by the end of 2024. USAID is also shifting to a people-centered justice approach to transform justice systems to better serve the people they are intended to serve. In the lead up to the review of SDG 16 next year, we are focused on building partnerships, including with non-traditional partners, to increase data, evidence, and financing to close the justice gap. In the build up to the third Summit for Democracy, hosted by the Republic of South Korea, USAID will continue to strengthen and expand these partnerships to maintain the momentum that has been generated through the summit process. All of these approaches, working across sectors, programming, policy engagement, partnerships, are critical everywhere that USAID works. They are especially important in countries where there are democratic openings. In such places, USAID is mobilizing resources across sectors to support democratic governments as they work to achieve tangible benefits that people feel in their everyday lives. This means that in addition to our own programming, we're encouraging other donors and private sector actors to crowd in investment that helps government reformers demonstrate a democratic dividend. At the recent Democracy Delivers event at UNGA, philanthropic and private sector partners made commitments totaling more than $110 million. That was on top of $145 million pledged by the U.S. government. The DRG Bureau is also committed to moving quickly and providing support that is responsive to local needs when windows of opportunity open. In the Maldives, where public and publicly guaranteed debt expanded from 78% to 150% of GDP due to economic contraction and COVID-19, and where climate vulnerabilities forced the government to take on more debt, USAID acted to establish a sound legal framework for debt management, supporting market-based mechanisms for debt processes and risk management, and helping to enhance transparency in borrowing. To institutionalize all of these efforts, in the coming months, we will release an updated DRG policy. The goal of this policy is to optimize USAID's support to our partners around the world to invigorate democracy, enhance human rights and justice, and bolster governance that advances the public interest and delivers inclusive development. Among other things, this policy will establish a shared vision of democracy's essential role in achieving development objectives in all sectors, and affirms the belief that other sectors have an essential role in contributing to democratic progress. At this pivotal moment in time, we need to band together and act collectively, including with those outside of the DRG community, outside of this room. Together, we can advance a world where freedom is flourishing and democracy delivers for all. Thank you.
Please bear with us as we just move into our next phase of this discussion. Please grab a seat. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Noam Unger, and I am the director of CSIS's Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative and a senior fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development. And I want to thank Marty, and I want to thank Marty for her opening remarks, and Shannon for those insights that you just shared on the mission of the new DRG Bureau and your outlook for it. I also want to welcome all of you who have joined us here at CSIS today. What a great group of champions for DRG that I see out here. I see Ro Tucci, Chloe Schwenke, Doug Rutson. I'm going to get myself in trouble, so I'm not going to. There's too many people who feel left out. But really, this is a tremendous gathering, and we're gathered to discuss the elevation of DRG, the importance of leveraging development investments even more broadly to advance democratic progress, and to contend with the persistent and even new challenges and threats to democratic development. It does indeed seem as though we are all experiencing a period of infectious global tumult, either because of real or perceived weaknesses in global order right now. And that's true really no matter which region of the world you look at today. And so it's particularly important to really focus on issues of democracy, rights, and governance. And we have wonderful experts up here with me to do just that. I want to welcome Catherine Elena and Gerardo Bertin to the conversation, along with Shannon. Katie is the Vice President for Programs at IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, where she provides leadership to programs worldwide. She's served in many different roles at IFIS, from technical assistance to management and field programs ranging from India and Afghanistan and Pakistan and many more, and serving as the organization's global legal advisor and also launching IFIS's Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. So she brings a wealth of experience, and she brings a wealth of experience from her other roles beyond IFIS, including as a former diplomat for New Zealand. So welcome. And Gerardo is the Vice President for International Programs at Freedom House and has worked within Freedom House in various roles throughout the world, including as Director of Latin America and Caribbean programs. Prior to Freedom House, he was a Senior Associate at Tetra Tech and an advisor at UNDP, both also focused on democracy and governance. And somewhere along the way, he's found time to author numerous books on related issues. So thank you both for joining us. And let's dive in. Gerardo, I want to begin with you, maybe in part because just earlier this week, we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. But what are some of the key emerging threats to human rights defenders and pro-democracy reformists today, and what opportunities does the new DRG Bureau present to deal with some of those issues?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really a privilege for me to be here, and congratulations to USAID for this new initiative. I look back at the 2014 DRG framework, it was called. It wasn't called policy. And going back, that's not long ago, the human rights chapter was a very interesting one, but today, probably whatever was mentioned there as programmatic recommendations is probably no longer relevant. I think the situation has increased in its intensity. I think it has different entry points. There are more actors involved, and as I will give a couple of examples, some of the emerging threats are not only national, but are actually transnational. So a couple of the emerging threats in the area of human rights. You're right, Noam. We are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Human Rights Defender Declaration. We are also celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. And I think those two anniversaries should give us the opportunity to kind of reset the button in human rights, particularly focusing on people and organizations who are still willing to fight for freedom and democracy around the world. In these events that we had a couple of days ago, particularly women human rights defenders and youth human rights defenders are at the front of these particular fights. Certainly, transnational repression is one area that Freedom House has looked at it because borders are no longer a deterrent for human rights violations. Also, the fact that human rights defenders are being forced to leave their countries leaves us with communities of human rights defenders in exile. And not only are we not able to support them, but also whatever they were doing in the countries of origins as leaders of human rights can no longer be done from a country outside. Protecting them has become basically a very important challenge. There is a very interesting report by the OECD looking at the closing of the civic space, not only in democracies, but also in emerging democracies, and how particularly authoritarian governments have used different tools, as Shannon was talking about, to deter, reduce that civic space. One issue in particular that is very interesting is, for example, the use of spyware against activists and HRDs. Our latest Freedom in the Net report shows that of the 70 countries that we analyze, in 50 of them, governments have used spyware against activists. The clearest example of that is what happened to Khashoggi, in which 2 weeks before he was assassinated, his family and his devices were actually infiltrated by spyware, leading to his demise. These are all elements that generate new thinking, as Shannon was saying, about how do we support them, and basic things. For example, how to provide resources to human rights defenders, particularly if they're in exile. There is an intended consequence because our exiles come from countries that have sanctions from the US government, for example. And the minute that you show that passport in a foreign country, it is very difficult to open a bank account. And the unintended consequences of that basically create a very difficult problem for them to reorganize and be able to survive. There's more than I can say, but I think human rights is probably one of these elements today in the DRG space that also needs to be looked at from the different intersections. I think Shannon was alluding. Corruption and human rights is back probably as a good nod to understand that where there is high corruption, likely there is also high human rights violations. Private sector, we were just talking about basically what is the role of the private sector in human rights in general, in a sense. And last but not least, the whole issue of technology and democracy and human rights. Where are those connections? And probably the new programming that Shannon is talking about is very important because now, not only DRG, but human rights needs to be looked at it from a holistic perspective. That's why she was rightly so elevating the effort to other sectors. We cannot do this alone. And so the new challenges are very, very profound. And certainly, we are probably at a time in which autocracies in particular have learned to use tools that we have in democracies actually to do the bad things that they do, and we need to somehow counteract with that. I don't know if you want me to expand on some of them, but initially I would say those are some of the challenges that I think we see in the new DRG human rights space. Yeah.
Thank you, Gerardo. Katie, I'll ask you a similar question about some of the new and emerging threats that you're seeing to core democratic institutions and norms, but from the perspective of elections and political processes.
Sure. Thanks, Noam. And again, thank you so much to CSIS and USAID for having me. I have to agree with you just looking out at the room. I feel like we could just open this as a panel full of experts and democracy warriors. So, when Shannon talks about the glass sort of being half full, I feel that when I'm actually looking out on the people who are in this room. But yes, I appreciate this question because you mentioned two different components here. And I think one is democratic norms, which I would say guide decision-making and behavior. And then the other piece, of course, is democratic institutions that provide the functional architecture for democracy to deliver, which, of course, is part of the Bureau's new statement. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, democracy is a governance system that has both normative value and functional value, and we should be concerned, I think, about threats to both of those components. So without wanting to seem reductive, I think, some of the new and emerging threats, I think, focus on a shift from autocrats in the past who perhaps were looking to replace democracy with a different kind of ideology or system, to now when they are more focused, I think, on manipulating the democratic system, that might be both the norms and the institutions, to meet their own ends, right? So it changes in some ways the type and the complexity of the problem. And because they are attacking sort of the foundations of the democratic system itself and maybe exploiting some of the dissatisfaction that might exist there, that's going to erode, again, both the norms, the behavior, the decision-making, but also the institutions. I was thinking when answering this question, I could give some examples from different countries, but that could go on for a long time. And maybe just some of the threats to illustrate it, maybe a fictional country. If I were looking to maybe have some political influence in a fictional country, we'll call it Zealandia. No nod to my home country. What would I be doing? What are we seeing in other countries? I think instrumentalizing elections first, right, to try and gain power, and you can do that in a whole lot of ways. I think co-opting democratic rhetoric, talking about anti-corruption and the fight against anti-corruption and how I am going to tackle that fight. Once in power, perhaps reinterpreting the law, using maybe legitimate processes to do that, to sort of tilt the legal playing field in some way. Slowly, perhaps capturing our independent institutions, the Election Commission itself, that's a great place I would start, Anti-Corruption Commission, audit bodies, many others. Pulling the levers of government finances, state resources, using them sometimes in legal ways to influence the outcome of the next election, right? Tilting that playing field. Taking advantage of dysfunctional opposition, or even going to the point of perhaps dissolving them. One I think we see everywhere, mining grievances, supplying distorted information. Again, maybe not illegal, but using perhaps the democratic media to do so. Demonizing vulnerable groups, making it worse, certainly with respect to human rights. Manufacturing or exploiting public discontent with democracy. Certainly using crises to curtail political rights, again, even through legitimate ways such as emergency powers, which we saw plenty of. And then lastly, really focusing in on these alliances with other autocrats that mimic democratic cooperation. So I'm certainly going to hold a summit with China and Russia as the leader of Zealandia and maybe a few others and talk about some important principles that seem to give me some legitimacy. So I think it's a daunting list of challenges, but I feel very similarly to Shannon in terms of the glass is half full because it's possible to break these down. It's possible to understand how these challenges are playing out in a particular country context and therefore be in a better position, I think, to try and address them. So I personally feel, it's easy to sit and read through the statistics, but I don't think the problem should be paralyzing because that would set us back further. And it's why, I'm so delighted that we have this new bureau to elevate these issues, to integrate them. I'm so delighted to see many of the Bureau colleagues here today. And the list of challenges are long, but I'm sure we can protect Zealandia from people such as myself and these tactics.
Thank you, Katie. Let me push you a little bit just on this, because you're saying don't be paralyzed, but the array of issues, of new emerging threats, really call for pivoting. So not being paralyzed, but pivoting to new ways of working. What are some of those pivots that you see that maybe the DRG Bureau and others working in alliance with the DRG Bureau should be taking?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we're already seeing some of these pivots with the new Bureau. And I think our pivots need to be both conceptual and they need to be practical if we're going to tackle these challenges. So in terms of a conceptual pivot, and we think about this a lot within IFIS, I think we need to accept that democracy is an ongoing effort and not an endpoint. And that's why I guess I referred to it earlier as a system. And I think one challenge for USAID, it's obviously a sector where success, we measure it in outputs and outcomes. So to think of it, in this broader way as sort of just literally an ongoing effort, that can be a challenging framing. But again, I don't think it has to be. We as a community have shifted our thinking and our framing before. And one example, I think, that demonstrates that is the framing of the electoral cycle, which I know many colleagues here will know very well. That framing did and still does serve a very important purpose, and it was particularly when first introduced to impel the community to move away from seeing elections as just election day to seeing it as a cycle, right? Pre-election, election day, post-election. But it seems to me now that there's a need for another conceptual pivot or shift to look at, the broader election environment. So, if we focus just on this cycle, are we giving a pass maybe to the longer term resilience building efforts that we need to actually do? And some of that, I think, the building of institutions, strengthening the environment for elections, you can't always fit that squarely into that electoral cycle. So we need to conceptually shift. We need to focus on the total environment in which elections take place. And that gets to many of the other sort of intersections that we talked about before. So if we can accept and make a conceptual shift, I think we can then shift incentives. So for example, away from elections as an end game. So, I would ask, are there really any graduated democracies anymore? Are there any liberal democracies that are free from illiberal threats? I would say no on both of those counts. Now, does that mean we need to invest in every country in the world all the time and not have an idea of where we're going? I don't think so. It just needs to shift how we engage. And that's where the practical pivot, I think, needs to come in. So, again, just example in the election space, rather than perhaps basing an intervention on the electoral cycle, perhaps we need to look at the trajectory that a particular country is in. Is it in the opening that Shannon talked about, a democratic opening? Is it going through erosion? Is it kind of full breakdown? Is it, really closed and an autocratic deepening? What's the specific democratic accountability structure and architecture there, and the specific ways that illiberal actors are undermining it, some of which I talked about before. So the answers to those questions can shape the practical pivot. So in some cases, we may need to capitalize on those democratic openings to spur reforms. In others, we might have to help these democracies bounce back, I think, from backsliding. There's a whole range that I think if we can break it down, we can make practical pivots that shift away from maybe some of the traditional types of interventions that we've done. Even in, countries of real autocracy and breakdown, sometimes our intervention might just be helping democracy persist in some diminished form until an opening comes. And one initiative Shannon mentioned was the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity, and that's a great sort of network and framework to be able to be supporting some of those initiatives. So if we can shift conceptually, if we can shift practically, I think we'll be in a position to respond. And I think, again, the Bureau is a great initiative at this time, because I'm hopeful it will allow USAID to help make some of those shifts and then kind of help us respond in a really timely way.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there is this sense that it is very important, maybe even high time. I think we're in a room and with people online, many of whom have wanted to see this Bureau elevated for a long time, and we're finally at that juncture. Shannon, I want to come back to you. You started by really enumerating a number of these challenges that we face and talking about the expectations for the Bureau. But you also mentioned a forthcoming DRG policy. So how do things like a new DRG policy and a new Bureau as opposed to a center really practically improve the agency's ability to focus on these issues and deliver?
That's a great question. A structure is a structure, right? But in a bureaucracy, structure really matters. And so what I would say, practically speaking, is that having a bureau puts DRG as a sector on par with the other development sectors: health, humanitarian assistance, economic growth, food security, and really allows us to do what I was talking about, which is not just integrate DRG principles into those other sectors, which we have been doing for many, many years, but also to get those sectors to see that they have a responsibility to be part of addressing the almost 20 years of democratic backsliding, that what they do and how they do it actually matters in terms of our ability to accelerate democratic development and to see democratic progress. So we are at the table now having those tough conversations. Sometimes it's very obvious and non-controversial that there would be harmony or alignment between those sectors' work and our work on DRG. In some cases, particularly where there is severe backsliding or where there is an entrenched kleptocracy or autocracy, our work can sometimes be in tension. And now DRG is sitting at the policy table with those sectors and having those tough conversations. And that's something that you'll really see come out of the DRG policy, is that we're finally grappling with some of those tensions. And I think you'll see much more meaningful engagements between DRG and some of those other sectors. That's number one. Number two, in terms of influencing regional and bilateral policy, it matters to have an AA and multiple DAAs and office directors. It gives us so much more surface area to engage with our counterparts and regional bureaus within USAID, with regional bureaus at the State Department and in the interagency. We can just be in so many more conversations trying to insert DRG into those conversations and really pushing for much better outcomes from a DRG perspective. So again, that matters. And then the final thing that matters bureaucratically is the access to USAID's front office. I think we have enjoyed over the last couple of years, because Administrator Power cares so much about these issues, really unprecedented access, but we can't take for granted that that will always be the case. And that the distance between the Bureau and the front office really matters when you're facing, sudden threats or backsliding, to get a tweet, to get the administrator to deploy, and do a trip, to raise these tensions between various sectors. Sitting at SMM, being able to access the front office, all of these things just allow us to move much more quickly and nimbly and sort of get the results that we are aiming to achieve. So that's the bureaucratic or structural shift. I think in terms of the policy, we've talked a lot about the conceptual shifts that I think you'll see coming out in the DRG policy. One, of course, is this idea of harnessing all development assistance to promote democratic progress. But another really important one, as Katie alluded to, is marrying up USAID's longstanding work building institutions and laws and policies and processes, with now recognizing that what is equally important are the norms and the people and the values, and sort of adhering to the rules of the game that really hold democracies together. So as you saw in our rule of law policy, which really pivots to focus on people-centered justice, so too will you see us emphasizing that pairing or that marriage between our work on capacity building and institutional work with just the hard work of trying to rebuild the norms that undergird democracy. And then finally, in terms of those conceptual shifts, what we're saying to the rest of the agency is we need to address digital repression and disinformation, which is affecting all of our work. And finally, that we need to continue the process of elevating anti-corruption across all development sectors. So the policy is really, saying to all of USAID, the functional bureaus, the regional bureaus, the missions, this is the direction that we're moving in. And it's really a call to action that we need to move together as an entire agency if we're going to see real progress and kind of shifting the trajectory that we're on.
When you were describing the shift and being part of SMM senior management meeting and being at the table and on par, it made me think of a time period. I was serving at AID, and this was about 8 years ago, when we were looking at essentially what was coming forward in more or less blue sky proposals in the early stages of CDCSs, of country development cooperation strategies. And in so many countries, country after country, especially across Africa at the time, but in country after country, USAID staff on the ground at the missions were saying there are real governance and democracy issues and rights issues that we need to be focused on. And you would see that elevated, sometimes rhetorically even within a country development cooperation strategy, but then you would look at a country's portfolio. Nigeria, I remember standing out, was like something like 94 or 95% global health money, with like the remaining percentage counted by so many other parts of USAID for sort of driving their agenda. That's what it looked like 8 years ago. How does that change, 8 years from now, after the Bureau has existed? Is what you're describing, does it lead to changes in that reality?
It's always going to be a challenge, as you know, because so much of our budget is earmarked and directed and carved up in all of these ways that really don't speak to the needs and the challenges on the ground. That said, again, with that seat at the table and the elevated role, one of our ambitions is to really get in there and fight for resources for DRG to make the case, not just on national security grounds, but also with data and evidence that DRG has been so effective in marshaling to really show why addressing those issues is critical to inclusive and sustainable development. So advocacy. Number two, that's why influencing how other sectors are using their money is so important. Even if we are, effective beyond our wildest dreams, there will always be so much more health money and so much more humanitarian assistance money. So we have to be able to influence the way they're spending that money and what they're doing. I mean, that's where the game-changing, that's where the game-changing interventions are. So again, that's why we're working so hard to influence all of those other bureaus. And then finally, what does matter is our, reach into the regional bureaus. They see these things too. And it can't just be us fighting for resources and making the case from a technical perspective. It really matters what regional bureaus say. And I will say from my last time in government, the sea changes that you now have leaders across the agency and regional bureaus and functional bureaus and missions and mission directors, also ambassadors and regional bureaus at the State Department who are no longer questioning whether we should do our DRG or how we should do DRG. They're all in, and that's a real difference. In large part, we're not convincing them anymore. They see the problems, they see the needs, and so we just need to be more effective in aligning ourselves with them and making the case for the resources. And I guess the final thing that I'll say is now that USAID does have an overarching policy framework, we are using that policy framework, which includes countering authoritarianism, bolstering human rights, and addressing corruption as one of its 5 main objectives. That is being factored in at the very front of CDCSs, and missions are being asked, what are you doing to advance USAID's policy priorities, and what are the obstacles? So at least we have a couple more hooks, I think, and more allies than we did 8 years ago.
Thank you. And Gerardo, you mentioned, there are tensions between these issues, to say the least. I mean, this is an administration that talks about putting human rights at the center of its foreign policy. You mentioned Khashoggi. There are tensions in and conflicts in foreign policy aims. Sort of, what are your hopes for how the DRG Bureau sort of helps to address some of those tensions?
Yes, for sure, yeah. I think, first of all, there is no blueprint, right? I mean, I think each case is unique, I think, but definitely innovation in programming. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Because now human rights defenders are crossing into countries where probably AID doesn't have a presence, but nonetheless, the need to support these human rights defenders and their organizations is there. That could be a way to rethink a little bit how we do programming. I can think of cases, for example, of human rights defenders from Zimbabwe crossing into South Africa, or Nicaraguans crossing into Costa Rica, Belarusians crossing into Lithuania, of course, and certainly AID as an entity, even though the US government is present, is not there, right? So there are bilateral missions as well in each of these countries. So that's one way a little bit maybe to start rethinking. The other one is the regional programs, I think. Those of you who have worked with AID for a long time, there was a time for regional programs, particularly in anti-corruption, which was actually very, very useful, because the problem is the same across the countries, but you adapt your programming to fit each of the countries. That needs to probably get some new thinking, I think. I also think that there is a lot of organizations in countries that have benefited from AID support over the years who can act as catalysts, as kind of network-making entities for the other organizations that have not had the chance. Any country that you look at it, there's a history basically of AID footprint of many years, and now they are by themselves pretty much fundraising. And there is a connection in those entities to another issue that Shannon has raised, which is the private sector, actually. How do we bring private sector into democracy issues beyond what is more obvious, which is corruption, for example, but human rights and the private sector is generally not as thought about. So there's a number of things that this DRG policy, I was privy to not the full thing, but parts of it, and I was able to actually provide inputs. And I think it's very interesting that the language also has changed, I think, which is very interesting. Social movements, for example, is something that will appear in the DRG, and that's important because that is the language basically sometimes of the other side, right? And certainly our version or framework is going to be a little bit more different. I also think that in each of these countries, and I do think that the policy touches upon this, these vulnerable groups, and by vulnerable I don't mean that they are victims, but certainly they are being encroached by authoritarian regimes. Youth, who in this barometer study that Shannon mentioned, are still in the majority want to live in democratic countries, even though there is an emerging percentage of them who, they don't care, they just want anybody who can resolve their problems, right? And obviously women. I think certainly there is, particularly in the area of human rights and democracy governance, a need for a shift in terms of basically how you manage and lead, and I think those two groups could provide very interesting programmatic ideas under this new DRG framework, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let me open it up. Somebody from our team has a microphone, and we'll take a few questions. I'm looking for who has the microphone. There we go. Okay. I saw one up here. We'll just get here. We'll do 1, 2, and then 3 here.
Mark Schneider. In response to your question to Shannon about the importance of a bureau, since I was in the first Human Rights Bureau in the State Department, believe me, it makes a difference when you represent the bureau and you're sitting with the secretary, with the other assistant secretaries. That makes a difference. The other is that Shannon started off her discussion. Well, first, Shannon, so happy that the bureau is happening, by talking about Guatemala and the basic efforts to undermine the democratic transition by basically eliminating Semilla. But the way they're doing it is by what we now are calling lawfare. That is using the court system and the judicial process to essentially destroy the democratic process. So one of the questions that I have is, how are you thinking about addressing that in terms of strengthening processes for the naming of just judges and prosecutors in a way that's important? The second, on the question of private sector. Its private sector can be positive. The Central American Partnership now is linked to TI to work on getting private sector partners to comply with their pledges in the OECD. But those private sector organizations also make campaign contributions. Katie, some of those are to candidates who don't represent strong anti-corruption. So how do you deal with that issue, particularly with respect to greater transparency?
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I caught those, and we're also going to take, we'll group them. We're also going to take right here from Tom, and then we'll come over. Was it to Chloe? Did you have a question? Okay.
Yeah, Tom Stahl, nice to see you all, and great to have this discussion. Congratulations, Shannon, on this new bureau. It's been a long time coming, I know, and it's great to see it. Lots of challenges in getting funding and so on, but I was really glad to hear about your approach of a whole of development and really integrating other parts of the agency. And especially, I wanted to focus my question on the G part of democracy and governance. I think a lot of authoritarian governments try to make the case that their way provides better governance than a truly democratic way. How do we answer that question and push back on that? And then I'd like to hear a little more about how do you incorporate democratic and human rights principles into other sectors? And what's your approach on that? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And over here, and then we'll come back to the dais here.
Well, thank you very much. Chloe Schwenke from the Center for Values in International Development. Very heartened to hear all the language about norms and values. That's a relatively new thing, and I'm really, really pleased to hear that. It's also an opportunity for an appeal to frame what the new Bureau does, not only, and I'm saying not only because what you're saying is important, but not only about the fight. The fight, of course, is important between democracy and autocracy, but about the persuasive pitch of democracy, the freedoms, the opportunities, the characteristics of values that are about solidarity, public service, care and compassion, things that really come with democracies that are really hard to capture in other spaces. You have such an amazing opportunity now to make the plea for freedom, to basically ring the sound of freedom loudly. And you have the values language, if you would only use it, to really bring the drivers of that democracy development forward. I'm making a deeper pitch too for the D that's underneath DRG, and that's the D of human dignity. Rights are not just, human rights concerns cannot be just about abuses. As important as that is, and I sat in your exact seat at Freedom House several years ago, it's not just the abuses, it's about rights as indicators of dignity. And what a wonderful thing to be in solidarity with. So thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Shannon, I'm going to turn them back over to you for your response here, and then we'll see if we've got time to pick up another couple comments.
Yep, I'll take a couple, including on the narrative piece, because Rotucci and others were really insightful and realized that we needed to do something to address the narrative and the perception that democracy is in decline and maybe this is the end of democracy and all of the deficit framing that we use. So we have done quite a bit of research, like trying to understand what language resonates with people when you talk about these issues. And Chloe, no surprise to you, of course, we found that when you root the discourse in values, that you're much more effective in engaging people where they're at, right? So values that a lot of people hold dear: freedom, equity, justice, fairness, dignity, opportunity. Like, these are the things that are universal, we found. So we're really trying to use language that focuses on the affirmative case for democracy. I talked about the glass being half full. And also getting away from some of the really technical language that we tend to use that doesn't connect with people's lived experiences, and root our discourse in the values. We're also, to Tom's point, really trying to marshal the data that disproves the authoritarian narrative that democracies don't deliver. Yes, it's absolutely spotty, no question about it, but there is quite a bit of data that says that democracies do, in fact, deliver better health outcomes, longer life expectancy, higher GDP. But we've let that narrative get away from us a little bit, and we're trying to recapture it. So I mentioned the administrator's article, our speeches, et cetera, et cetera. We are trying to go on the offensive and make the case that not only do people want to live in democracies because it is the best system that we have for advancing human dignity, but because it is also far more effective in delivering the things that people want. That said, we need to make it a lot more effective. Like, we can't shy away from the fact that in a lot of democracies, power has been concentrated in the hands of the few, and it has not been delivering not just public services, but like public policies that really speak to what people want, because they're so distorted by money and politics and corruption and all of these things. So the focus on democracy delivering is both about being present in those places where there are windows of opportunity, but it's also a broader philosophy that we're trying to really embrace in the DRG Bureau and in the DRG sector that connects our work to the work in other development spaces. And then finally, Mark, on lawfare, I'll say a couple of things. I mentioned Reporter Shield, which is a way that we're providing liability coverage to reporters that are facing SLAPP lawsuits. We're also engaging in a number of countries to help vet judges and make sure that they don't have connections to authoritarian or kleptocratic actors. That is highly politically sensitive, but that's a shift that we made many years ago. Like, we accept that our work is very political at the end of the day. So we need to do more of that. And then finally, as you and I have talked about, we are leaning in as USAID to influencing sanctions, targeting, and determinations. We have GLOMAG. It can be an effective tool in addressing corrupt actors and people who are violating human rights, including judges and people who are in the justice sector that are undermining democracy, as they have been in Guatemala. So all of those things are on the table. And I think the thing that's been really empowering under Administrator Power's leadership is she has really encouraged us, like, where there is a problem to be solved, where there is something to be done, we have a role and a responsibility in USAID and at USAID to lean into those spaces, even if they're beyond our traditional spaces. And so engaging in those sanctions conversations and informing people about how the behavior of those actors is affecting election integrity and the like is one contribution that we can make.
And I think to Gerardo's point earlier about closing space for civil society in different ways, some of the models for working on lawfare with regard to journalists can and should be expanded in other ways to broader sort of groups across civil society that are being targeted by lawfare with the intention of actually shutting down their ability to operate. So I'm going to cut a deal with you as the moderator of this session, which is that I will allow it to go on for another couple minutes, only another couple minutes, but only if the next set of questions are much shorter than the last.
For these guys too.
Exactly. So I'm going to go on for just another minute, and I see one hand right here in the red. Yep. And I'll take one question over on there on that side as well, and then we'll wrap up with final comments from everyone.
Okay.
Please.
Hi, Mia Baxley, Search for Common Ground and the Scoville Peace Fellowship. Short question, challenge accepted. What is your plan to promote the fact that democracy is a process and would take a long time?
Thank you for the short question. And then let's come over here. We're going to grab one last short question. There was a gentleman, with the hand up there. Democracy takes time, and sometimes getting the microphone across a big room of people takes some time too. It's fine.
No problem. Luis Olafia with the American Bar Association. So I don't know if the question would be up to the panelist. So do you think this new position of the DRG Bureau will open a conversation about rethinking countries within USAID? Would the new bureau also open conversations with other agencies within the U.S. government? We know USAID footprint is very small, and there's a lot of things that contribute towards democracy, commerce, trade, defense. So would that also open those conversations?
Great, thank you so much. So, Shannon, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with you to respond to some of these, but then I'm going to finish with our panelists just for some reflections and hopes for going forward. So please.
1,000%. I think we've already shifted our language from talking about democracy as an endpoint to democracy as an ongoing process. the quotes that we oftentimes use is one from Ronald Reagan that says, like, democracy is not a wilting flower, but it requires constant cultivation, or something along those lines. The idea being that even in our own country, you just have to stick with it. You're going to see ebbs and flows, but it's a very dynamic process, and we have to continue to adapt. So I think you'll see much more language that embraces that idea of democracy as a system, as a process, and as an ideal that requires constant cultivation. Yes, on your point, I mean, that's part of the idea of having greater ability to shape policy and to have influence, is to engage across the entire interagency. On the anti-corruption front, we have been doing that. We have a couple countries of focus where we've been trying to figure out what are all of the tools and the levers that we have at our disposal across the entire US government that we need to marshal in order to advance anti-corruption. We want to do the same in all the other spaces in which we're working. And then sort of finally, I think a subset of your question about the countries, I think you're already seeing some adaptation. We thought that we were done with Eastern Europe. Clearly we are not. We are back in Eastern Europe and Central Europe in a big way because of the threats and the opportunities there. And I think to Gerardo's point, we're also trying to figure out how to work across borders transnationally, again, because so many of the challenges that we're facing do not stay in one country. They're influenced by these cross-border dynamics. So you're already seeing, and I think we'll see more regional programming, more global programming to address those transnational dynamics.
Thank you so much. Gerardo, a last closing thought, and then Katie?
Yeah, no, thank you again for the invitation, the start of this conversation. I think I have two thoughts. One, on the issue of, when we talk about civic space, I think I meant to say that there is now an online civic space as well, which also I think the policy will respond. The other one has to do with this interagency collaboration that Shannon has talked about. We as Freedom House deal with both AID and with DRL, and often, basically, we need to articulate that conversation, particularly when it comes to both emergency assistance for human rights defenders, but also the longer term to provide actually much more sustainable assistance. So those two issues to me are very important, and whatever I was able to see on the policy, which is 10 years actually, I think I will last 10 years, I understand, they have touched upon, but now the detail basically is in making it a practice and an actionable, actually, which will probably be more at the country level, I would say.
Thank you. Katie?
I'll copy Gerardo and maybe just end with two things as well. And I think one just gets to the integration, and you mentioned interagency, and I was also thinking, into implementation and really integrating programming. And I think when we make choices about, supporting democracy and promoting development, we have to take into account how one realm is going to impact the other, both negative and positively. And certainly as a technical implementer myself, I've been so frustrated for so long about certain types of work that happens in silos, which undermines potentially the actual impact of what work is taking place. And maybe just quickly two examples. Let's say a conflict or post-conflict environment. We've often been asked, why are we thinking about electoral systems at that time? Because systems of representation are going to help be part of the pathway out of that conflict. So why are we doing electoral systems, in a silo from peace building and conflict programs? Similarly, the reason we set up the Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust within IFIS was, campaign finance used to be a topic that was so boring and technical and no one wanted to talk about it. But now it's, people realize, I think, that that's the epicenter of where a lot of public corruption begins, right? And so why are we doing anti-corruption programming and, electoral programming, et cetera, in a silo? That just has to change. Last one, people-centered justice. Judges at the forefront of protecting the will of the people in elections these days, right? That should be integrated, elections justice programming. So that's important. The second point, just to leave with, I think, how do we get that integration? One thing we haven't mentioned yet on this panel, which I think is terrible, localization. Obviously key for USAID, and I think involving diverse local partners, beneficiaries, stakeholders in the design, the implementation, the evaluation of the programming, maybe that's how we'll get some more of that implementer integration. History's littered with, I think, inflection points. I think we're in one, but, there's people have stood up in those times, and I'm hopeful that they will again. So.
Thank you. That's where I began, and where you just ended was that we are at an inflection point, and I am glad that people are standing up and that this Bureau is standing up. So please join me in thanking Shannon and Gerardo and Katie, and thank you so much. And for those of you joining us in person, we do have a reception right outside. Thank you so much.